As you approach and enter the public markets as a management team and as a CEO, the context of your engagement with investors changes very significantly. As a private company and having private investors in the company, you feel like you're on the same side of the table, meaning you can share all of the information around your clinical trials or preclinical studies with them. In a lot of cases, they're focused on helping the company succeed. I think in part because as private investors, it's very hard for them to exit their investments in the company. I mean, those investments are inherently illiquid. As a public company, you cannot disclose everything you're doing to your investors, which means there's constantly an issue of information asymmetry. But the other thing is that the investors can exit their positions pretty quickly. So sometimes it feels like you're on the opposite ends of the table trying to convince them to, remain invested, remain interested in the stock, whereas in the private markets, you don't, encounter that dynamic as significantly. In the public setting, you are engaging investors constantly, talking to investors to get them more engaged into the story, focus on the stock so that they acquire the stock. Buying the stock typically means a higher stock price. A higher stock price typically means a lower cost of capital. And in general, a lower cost of capital means that you can advance your pipeline maybe faster or in a more capital efficient manner because the capital that you're accessing is cheaper for the company. It's a major transition from being a private company because you have this constant activity focused on investor relations, increasing the profile of the company with Wall Street, and ultimately this hopefully will result in a lower cost of capital and a higher share price. Once you've gone public, there are a whole new set of rules that you need to be aware of. You are, in a way, in a fishbowl, that everything you're doing is visible, hiring management team members, clinical data, you have to disclose it publicly if it's material. As a private company, you have no considerations around disclosure rules. As a public company, this is a very, very important undertaking to really understand what the disclosure rules are around materiality of information. Material information means clinical trial data. What context of data, meaning the performance of the therapy, represents a material disclosure? There's legal frameworks around this, but they're not cut and dry, they're gray. And in some cases, it requires the management team's judgment as to what materiality actually means. But companies have run afoul of this. They've lost credibility with Wall Street by believing materiality has one threshold and Wall Street believes it has another. So it's really important to both understand from your legal advisors, but also just from the investment community in general, what they believe would be material from a disclosure perspective for your clinical stage programs. I think those are important insights to think about, and also to structure the sequence of data that you intend to disclose to Wall Street in a manner that doesn't have you sitting on material information for extended periods of time and not disclosing it publicly. That could become a challenge because as you have material information, sitting inside of the company, you ultimately have to restrict, who has access to it, and restrict, how and who can talk about it. And the idea of having that material information out in the public domain in a time frame that's close to, when you believe that threshold of materiality is reached is important to think about as you design your clinical data readouts and your pipeline evolution. For the biotechnology sector, because we don't generate revenues and profits, the primary focus of public market investors is on understanding the evolution of our pipelines and namely our clinical stage assets. And so this is a very complex undertaking. I mean, explaining clinical data to the public markets is something that I would argue is more complex than giving, revenue and profit guidance. So a management team and a CEO needs to understand how to guide investors in the public markets towards the type of results they may expect to see coming out of the clinical trial. And this is not a straightforward exercise. Guiding investors on clinical trial results is not something you need to do in the private markets. It's not something you would learn in the private markets. So it is something that you need to begin to understand as you approach the public markets, because exceeding that guidance will be the key to achieving, compelling valuations in the public markets, gaining credibility with Wall Street, and ultimately allowing you to capitalize your company at an attractive, cost of capital.